My name is Oakley, and I am 27 years old. I never imagined the most defining moment of my life would unfold not in private, not behind closed doors, but in front of a crowded wedding hall filled with people who believed they were there to celebrate love, not witness a battle for dignity. The music was still playing when everything began to fracture. Soft lights shimmered across crystal decorations, glasses clinked, and the air carried that fragile happiness that only weddings seem to create. I remember standing there in my white dress, hands trembling not from nerves but from the overwhelming realization that my entire future was about to be tested. Just minutes earlier, I had been smiling for photos, hearing congratulations and convincing myself that after years of struggle, heartbreak, and rebuilding, I had finally reached my moment of peace. Then she stood up. My mother-in-law-to-be did not clear her throat, did not ask for attention politely. She simply rose from her chair with a confidence that silenced the room without effort. Conversations faded, forks paused midair, and every eye shifted toward her as if instinctively sensing something was wrong. What followed did not sound real at first. It sounded like something from a cruel drama, the kind you assume could never happen to you. But her voice was steady, sharp, and impossible to misinterpret. In the middle of my wedding, my mother-in-law-to-be declared, "If you don't forfeit your inheritance rights to the 10 condos, the wedding is off." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. 10 condos. My inheritance. The properties my late father had built through decades of sacrifice. The assets he left not as luxury, but as security, as protection, as proof that his daughter would never have to depend on anyone's mercy. The room seemed to tilt. I could feel hundreds of guests shifting uncomfortably, yet no one spoke. My fiancé froze beside me, his silence louder than anything else. I searched his face for disbelief, for anger, for anything that resembled defense, but all I saw was conflict, the terrible, cowardly kind born when someone is forced to choose between family pressure and moral courage. My heart pounded as the reality settled in. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a demand. A public, calculated attempt to corner me into surrendering what was mine, wrapped in the threat of humiliation. She continued speaking, each sentence colder than the last, framing her ultimatum as concern, as practicality, as if stripping me of my rights was somehow a reasonable prerequisite for marriage. I could hear whispers spreading across the hall, guests pretending not to stare while staring anyway. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. The fear that had initially paralyzed my thoughts began transforming into something sharper, steadier. I thought about my father, about the years he worked without rest, about the promise he once made me. Never let anyone reduce your worth to what they can take from you. My mother-in-law-to-be believed the setting gave her power. She believed the pressure of the audience would force compliance. She believed I would crumble under the weight of embarrassment. Instead, I felt an unexpected calm, a terrifying clarity. My pulse slowed, my breathing steadied, and I became aware of one simple truth. This was not just about property. This was about control, respect, and the kind of precedent that would define every day of my married life. If I surrendered now, I would surrender forever. The music had stopped completely. The hall was silent enough to hear fabric rustle and nervous coughs. I became aware of the microphone positioned near the stage, the same microphone intended for speeches and laughter, now standing like an unspoken challenge. My mother-in-law-to-be waited, confident, expecting hesitation, perhaps tears. Instead, I lifted my dress slightly and began walking. Each step echoed louder than it should have. I could feel shock ripple through the guests as I moved past tables, past frozen faces, past my fiancé who still had not spoken. My thoughts were no longer scattered. They were focused, precise, fueled by a rising determination I did not know I possessed. The closer I came to the microphone, the clearer my resolve became. I was not walking toward conflict. I was walking toward my voice, toward a moment that would decide whether I entered marriage diminished or unbroken. I reached the stage, wrapped my fingers around the microphone, and turned to face the room that moments ago had been celebrating my happiness. Now every gaze locked onto me, waiting, uncertain, sensing that whatever came next would change everything. I took a breath, feeling the weight of expectation, of judgment, of disbelief, and prepared to speak. The sound of my own breathing amplified through the speakers. A faint but undeniable reminder that the entire hall was waiting for me. Hundreds of eyes fixed on me. Some curious, some uncomfortable, some already anticipating drama. My mother-in-law-to-be remained standing, her expression carved from certainty, convinced that I would plead, apologize, or surrender. Instead, I tightened my grip on the microphone and let the silence stretch, just long enough for the tension to become unbearable. I want everyone here to clearly understand what was just said. I began, my voice steadier than I felt. A ripple moved through the crowd. No one expected calm. No one expected composure. In the middle of my wedding, my mother-in-law-to-be declared, "If you don't forfeit your inheritance rights to the 10 condos, the wedding is off." The words echoed across the hall with brutal clarity. Gasps surfaced instantly, no longer whispers but open reactions. I watched faces change, shock, disbelief, embarrassment, emotions spreading like a wave. I turned slightly, enough to meet her gaze without flinching. "Thank you," I continued, and the confusion that flickered across the room was almost audible. "Thank you for saying it publicly. Thank you for making the choice so clear." My fiancé shifted behind me, finally understanding that the narrative she intended to control was slipping away. I could see panic forming where hesitation once lived. "You see," I said, letting each word land deliberately, "marriage built on coercion is not marriage. Love negotiated through threats is not love. And respect demanded through humiliation is not respect." The hall was utterly still now. Even those who moments earlier avoided eye contact leaned forward. Those 10 condos are not bargaining chips. They are not gifts for approval. They are my father's legacy, earned through a lifetime of sacrifice. Left to me with trust, not as a test of obedience. My mother-in-law-to-be attempted to interrupt, her confidence cracking into agitation, but the crowd's attention had shifted entirely. The authority she assumed was dissolving under collective scrutiny. I raised my hand slightly, not angrily, but decisively. "No," I said firmly. "You've had your moment. This is mine." A murmur of agreement passed through the guests. Something powerful happens when silence breaks in favor of fairness. "Here are my 3 announcements," I declared, the phrase sending a visible jolt through the room. "First, I will not forfeit anything that defines my independence. My security or my dignity. Not today, not ever." The words felt like steel leaving my chest. "Second, a wedding that requires surrendering. Self-respect deserves to be called off." A collective intake of breath swept across the hall. My fiancé's face drained of color. "And third," I said, my voice softening but only slightly, "I refuse to join a family that views partnership as acquisition rather than acceptance." The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting could have been. It carried realization, finality, truth. I lowered the microphone slowly, not as defeat but as closure. The decorations, the music, the elaborate preparations, all of it suddenly seemed irrelevant, compared to the clarity of that moment. My mother-in-law-to-be's outrage erupted, her voice sharp, fractured, desperate to regain control. But it no longer held the same power. The audience had heard enough. They had seen enough. My fiancé took a hesitant step forward, words forming too late, courage arriving after necessity. I looked at him, really looked, and understood something that hurt yet liberated me. Silence in the face of injustice is a decision, not an accident. Without another word, I stepped away from the stage. Each movement felt surreal yet unwavering. The path I walked back through the hall was nothing like the one before. I was no longer a bride moving toward a ceremony. I was a woman moving toward self-preservation. I could sense the shift in the crowd. Sympathy, admiration, stunned reflection, emotions. Far stronger than the discomfort that had filled the room earlier. Outside the venue, the air felt startlingly cold, grounding, real. The noise of the hall faded behind me, replaced by a quiet that felt almost sacred. There was no dramatic collapse, no cinematic chase, no sudden reversal. Only a profound, unshakable certainty that I had chosen correctly. Some endings are not tragedies. They are rescues disguised as losses. And if you've ever faced a moment where your worth was weighed against someone else's demands, remember this: the bravest decision is not always staying. Sometimes it is walking away before compromise becomes captivity. If this story resonated with you, if you believe dignity should never be negotiable and self-respect should never require permission, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us of the power we hold when we refuse to be diminished.